Hello viewers, welcome to this video. I've decided to do some videos around KOPS, Kubernetes operations. I'm planning to do like 3 or 4 videos around the KOPS topic. So using KOPS, you can deploy a Kubernetes cluster in AWS, which is fully supported. And using KOPS, you can also deploy a Kubernetes cluster in GCP or in Azure, which is in the beta version, but AWS is fully supported. So that's what we'll be seeing in this video and in the next few videos. So the first video is about how to create a Kubernetes cluster in AWS using KOPS. So using KOPS, you can deploy a production-ready, highly available Kubernetes cluster, and it's easy to manage. So there's a bit of automation here, so you don't have to use kubeadm command to manage your clusters. So we've seen EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service in AWS, and we've seen how to deploy it using EKS CTL. And this one is not a managed Kubernetes service. We are using an automation tool called KOPS, and we will be deploying the master nodes, the worker nodes. So all the nodes are under our control, so it's not managed by AWS. And yeah, let's get started. So this first video is about how to create your first cluster. And then the second video, I will show you how to upgrade your cluster to a specific version, and how to add your nodes, how to add a new node, or how to remove a worker node or a master node, and so on. And then finally we will tear this complete environment down. Alright, so I've logged into my AWS management console into the EC2 dashboard, and let's go to the KOPS GitHub repository. KOPS Kubernetes. Okay, there it is. I'll put a link to this GitHub repo in the video description. Okay, so KOPS Kubernetes, you can read through the documentation, but I'm going to go to the releases. And 1.17.0 is pre-release, but I'm going to look for the latest stable release, which is this one, 1.16.0. Down here, I'm going to download the KOPS binary for Linux x86 64, which is Linux AMD 64 here. Copy the link address. I'm going to use wget to download that. So once that's downloaded, we need to move that into a path. So I'll be moving that into user local bin, and then we need to set the executable permission so that we can start running the KOPS command. Alright, so that's done, and I'm going to move it. Sudo move KOPS Linux AMD 64 to user local bin, and I'm changing the name of the binary to KOPS so we don't have to type in this entire thing. Alright, and the next thing is sudo changemod +x user local bin KOPS. Cool. Okay, so now if I do which KOPS, user local bin KOPS, you can do KOPS version 1.16.0. So at the time of recording this video, the latest release is 1.16.0. Depending on when you're watching this video, the version might be a different one. So things might have changed slightly, so bear that in mind. Alright, so in my EC2 management console here, you can see there are no instances running. Absolutely, it's a clean AWS account. I have deleted everything. So once we create the cluster, I'm going to walk you through what resources it has created for us in our AWS account. Alright, so KOPS help. So we've got lots of options here. KOPS create, delete, describe, edit, export, get, help. So for this video, we will be looking at the create command. All right. So KOPS create help. KOPS create. You can give it a file name by having your cluster configuration there. Or you can, it's just a YAML file. You can specify all your cluster configuration in the YAML file and then pass it to the KOPS create command. Or you can just run the KOPS create cluster command directly. So that's the command. KOPS create cluster -- name. You need to give your cluster a name, -- state. We need to create a bucket. So that's where Kubernetes KOPS stores its state. So if you used Terraform before, you write code and you deploy your infrastructure, and the state of your infrastructure is stored in a file called a state file, Terraform state file. So whenever you update your code and deploy it, it will check your state file and it will check the current state of your infrastructure and then do the updates. So similarly, KOPS uses a state file which is stored in S3. So before creating the cluster, we need to be creating an S3 bucket, which we will do in a short while. Zones, node count, node size, we'll go through all these. And okay, so let's go into the command in detail. KOPS create cluster -- help. If I pipe that to less, there are a couple of options here. You can see here, create a cluster in AWS, KOPS create cluster, give it a name, -- state, zones, in which zones you want to deploy your cluster, how many number of worker nodes you want to specify, and so on. Or you can specify the master node count, master zones, master size. There are a variety of options here, and if you scroll down, you can see all the available options here. Maybe if I make it bigger. No, that's not the one. I kind of forgot my okay, let me move this to the next workspace. Okay, so that's better. Okay, so there are loads of flags that you can use with KOPS create cluster command, but we're going to use a bare minimum, and then you can always go through these things later if you want. So for example, here you can specify the number of masters you want, the security groups that you want to attach to your master, node count, how many number of worker nodes you want, security groups that you want to attach to your node, node size, so that means the type of instance that you want to deploy. So I think by default the master nodes will be m4.large or something, and the worker nodes will be t3.medium. I'm not completely sure, but you can override. You can specify what type of instance you want for your master nodes or for your worker nodes. Alright, so SSH access. So if you want to have SSH access to your master nodes and worker nodes, you can specify what public or private key, what private key you want to use with it. And there's the public key here. And VPC, if you don't specify VPC or subnets, it's going to create a new VPC, new subnet, route tables and everything. But if you want to use an existing VPC and existing subnets, you can specify VPC, subnets and so on. Zones, as I said earlier, on which zone you want to deploy your cluster. So you don't have to worry about it. You can just create a cluster right now with any set of options, and you can always update your cluster. Alright, it's like Terraform thing. Name of the cluster and all those things. Okay, there are lots of options here, and you can go through them if you want, and I'm going to start creating a cluster now. Okay, the first thing is you need to have your AWS CLI configured, because KOPS is going to use your AWS CLI. So I've done a separate video, I think in my Learn AWS playlist. I've got a fourth video, I think, how to configure your AWS CLI. Say for example, AWS S3 LS, you should be able to run your AWS commands. AWS EC2, describe instances. I don't have any instance at the moment. So basically, I'm interacting with my AWS management console from the command line. So AWS CLI needs to be configured. You need to create your access key, secret key, and then configure your AWS command line tool. Okay, so with AWS CLI configured, we are going to create a bucket, and we are going to enable versioning for that bucket, because it's always a good practice. It's suggested, it's advisable to enable versioning, because you're storing the state of your cluster. If something goes wrong, you can go to your S3 bucket, revert your state to a previous version or something, and then you can apply the changes. So it's advisable to enable versioning for your S3 bucket. So first we are going to create S3 bucket. All right, AWS S3 API create bucket. I'm giving a bucket name, just me K8s KOPS store, and I'm specifying the region US East 1. Okay, so that's created. Now if I do AWS S3 LS, there we go, that's our bucket, and the bucket is currently empty. AWS S3 LS, name of the bucket. And you can see here the bucket is currently empty. So once we create our cluster, we will have the state file in this bucket. So now we are going to enable versioning for this bucket. You can always do this in the management console if you find it easier, but I prefer the command line AWS S3 API put bucket versioning, and the name of the bucket, the region where you created your bucket, versioning configuration status is enabled. That's it. That's all you need. So we have our bucket created, we have our configuration set for the versioning. Versioning is enabled in our bucket. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to export a variable called KOPS state store. So the reason I'm exporting this variable is for all the KOPS command, you need to specify the variable. All right. You need to specify the state file. So instead of specifying the state file in every single KOPS command, you can just export it once and you can ignore it. You don't have to use it in your KOPS command. Okay, so KOPS state store, I'm exporting the variable, and the value is s3 : / and then just me k it is KOPS store. That's the name of the bucket we just created. So I've exported that. And if you don't do that for every single KOPS command, for example, KOPS get cluster, KOPS create cluster, you need to do KOPS state is s3 : just me k8 as KOPS store, and whatever operation you want, and so on. So instead of specifying that, to save some time, I'm exporting that variable, so now we don't have to do that. All right. So now we are good to create our cluster. KOPS create. Now if I do KOPS get cluster, no clusters found because we haven't created one. All right, so let's create our first cluster. KOPS create cluster. We need to give it a name, -- name. I'm going to give it just me dot k it is dot local -- zones. You're going to specify which zone, because my AWS CLI is configured for EU West 1, which is Ireland region, and in the Ireland region, in which particular zone that I want to create my cluster. So I'm specifying EU West 1A. I'm just creating this cluster in just one zone, but if you want, you can create it in multiple zone. For example, EU West 1B, EU West 1C, and so on. All right. It's just a comma separated value, but I'm going to use that one. All right. So you need to bear that in mind. Depending on the number of zones you specify, there will be one master node for a single zone, for every single zone. So now I'm specifying just one zone. So I'm going to get one master node. You can always say, okay, I'll come to that in a minute. So now I'm specifying master size t2.micro. I don't have to specify this. I will get by default a particular instance type, which I think is m4.large. I don't want to spend too much of money for creating that master node. This is just for demonstration purpose. So I'm restricting the size of the master to t2.micro. That's the master node's instance type. All right. -- node size. So that's the instance type for the worker nodes. Again, I'm going to specify t2.micro. And what you can also do is you can specify that Kubernetes version that you want. So I'm saying I want version 1.16.0, or let's say I want version 1.15.0, for example. The reason I'm not going with the latest is to show you how you can upgrade your Kubernetes cluster using KOPS in my next video. All right. So that's the reason I'm specifying this. If you want to use the latest Kubernetes version, you don't have to specify that. So it will automatically provision you the latest supported Kubernetes version for this KOPS release. So, but I'm going to specify 1.15.0 because later, or let's say 1.16.0, and later I will show you how you can upgrade to a specific version. So in the next video, I will show you, once we create this cluster, in the next video, we will see how to upgrade this Kubernetes cluster once we deploy it to version 1.16.3, for example, a specified version, or if you want to upgrade to the latest available version, how you can do it, which we will see in the next video. All right. So we've got that. That's all I'm going to, that's all the options that I'm going to use. But if you want to specify, because you have specified one zone for the zones option, you will get one master node, and by default you will get 2 worker nodes, and you can always override it. Let's say master count is 2 minus node count is 5, for example. So you will get 5 plus 2, 7 nodes. But I'm going to stick with 1 master node and 2 worker nodes. So there is no high availability because we are just deploying 1 master node because we have specified zones is 1. But here, if you specify additional zones, you will get a master node per zone. All right. Okay, I think that's all we need. Once I hit enter, it's going to take 10-15 minutes for the cluster to be created. And the other thing that you need to bear in mind is, although we have just 1 master, it will still be behind a load balancer, so that in the future, if you want to add additional master node, you don't have to do any change. You can just add additional master node, that's it, because we already have a load balancer. So all the interactions to your cluster, to your API server is through the load balancer. So once the cluster is created, we will go through all the resources that it has created in our AWS management console. All right. Okay, so KOPS create cluster. It says the latest Kubernetes version is 1.16.7, but that's fine. We are going with 1.16.0. And if you scroll here, you can see what it is going to deploy. So security group, load balancers, subnets, route table, instance profiles, VPC, and everything. So the VPC it's going to create is this one with 1 subnet, security groups, and all those things. So you can go through all the resources that it's going to create. Okay, so we've got our cluster created. It hasn't actually created any cluster, but it has created the configuration. All right, so where is the configuration? KOPS edit cluster. Okay, before that, let's do KOPS get cluster. So now we can see here, we gave the name of our cluster justme.k8s.local, and we've specified the AWS cloud by default, and in the zones EU West 1A. So we've got a cluster. It's not actually deployed. We only have the configuration ready. We need to update the configuration. So KOPS edit cluster minus name, and that's the cluster configuration that got generated when we ran the command KOPS create cluster. So now we need to update this version. So Kubernetes version is 1.16.0. There's the network CIDR, SSH access, subnets, and all those things. All right, so that's the KOPS state store. Okay, so now we're going to apply this. KOPS update cluster minus name justme.k8s.local, and you need to pass -s option, and that will create your cluster. Okay, so this is going to take 10 to 15 minutes, I guess. And once that's done, we can take a look at what resources it has created. All right, I'm going to pause the video and come back when it's ready. All right, the command completed within like 10-15 seconds, and you can see here actually the cluster is starting in the background. It should be ready in a few minutes, and we also have few options here. So we can see whether the cluster is ready by doing KOPS validate cluster, list nodes kubectl get nodes, SSH to the master, and we can see how we can SSH to the individual machines. And if I do KOPS validate cluster minus name just me, and you can see here validating cluster, unexpected error during validation, error listing nodes. That's because the cluster is still getting created. So we will have to run this command periodically. Within about 10-15 minutes you will see a valid output for KOPS validate cluster. All right, so I'm gonna pause the video again and come back when it's ready. All right, I just verified the command completed successfully, and if I do KOPS validate cluster now, you can see that your cluster is now in the ready state. And you can see here there is it has created two instance group. So one is the master instance group, with minimum 1, maximum 1. So whenever it creates a master node and worker nodes, it will put them inside an auto-scaling group. So when it comes to adding a new node, we just update the instance group and set the desired number, alright? So which we will cover in the next video. So the machine type is t2.micro. So we have 2 worker nodes here. So we've got 2 worker nodes and 1 master node, and our cluster is ready, alright? So KOPS get cluster. That's our cluster, and we can now do kubectl commands as usual, and it would have created a config file here automatically under your home directory under the .kube directory, so you're good to run your kubectl commands. Kubectl version --short. Right, so server version is 1.16.0, which is what we deployed. Kubectl get nodes. So we have 1 master node and 2 worker nodes, all looking good. Kubectl get namespace. Okay, kubectl get storage class. So it comes with a couple of storage classes, and one of them is the default storage class. So you can start using storage provisioning. Kubectl get namespace. Kubectl -n kube system get all. So everything is working great. So let's deploy a sample Nginx application. Kubectl run Nginx --image Nginx. Kubectl get all. Alright, so our Nginx pod is being started now. Kubectl get all. Alright, so we've got our Nginx pod running fine. Let's see if we can access our pod. I'm not going to expose it as a service. I'm just going to use port forwarding. Kubectl port forward. That's not my Nginx container. Okay, so I'm going to forward that to port 8080 on my local machine. Okay, so now if I go to my browser and go to localhost :8080, there we go. That's our Nginx welcome page. So everything is running fine. Kubectl delete deploy Nginx. Kubectl get all. So we have our first cluster running fine. So if I do AWS S3 LS, so that's our bucket that we created. So the KOPS state will be stored in this bucket, and now you can see there is the directory here. So you will have a directory, you will have a top level folder or directory for each of your cluster. So our cluster is named justme.kats.local. So we have a directory under the KOPS bucket that we created. KOPS get cluster. Okay, so now it's time to look at the things that it has deployed for us. So let's go to our AWS management console and look at what it has actually created. All right, so let's go in here. All right, so I'm in the EC2 dashboard. You can see running instance, 3 running instances. We have volumes, and we have 1 load balancer. We have 2 key pairs, and we've got 5 security groups. Let's go through them. So if I go to the running instance, you can see here all of them will be tagged appropriately. So you can find, even if you deploy this in your existing AWS account, you should still be able to find the resources that KOPS has deployed by the name of your cluster. justme.kats.local, justme.kats.local. So that's the master node, and we've got the 2 worker nodes here, and they're all t2.micro. So when we did the KOPS create cluster, and if you had left out the node size and the master size, and you can see what default instance type it selects for the master node and the worker nodes. Okay, so that's instances, and we can see the security groups. So we have a couple of security groups. So this security group is the default security group when we for the default VPC, and we have 2 security groups, one for the master node and one for the worker node. So if I go to the master node and look at the inbound rules, so there are lots of ports that are allowed. So we have SSH open to the public 0.0.0. So we should be able to connect SSH to our master node given we have our private key. All right. So now if I look at the worker nodes security group, again port 22 is allowed from anywhere, and all traffic is allowed for this security group, which is the security group that we have here, AFD8, so that master nodes can communicate on all ports without any restrictions. So all traffic between master and worker nodes are allowed. So that's security group. And we've got a load balancer. Let's look at the load balancer. So we have the load balancer, which is internet facing, because we need to be able to access the API server from the internet. So it's not an internal load balancer, it is internet facing load balancer, listening on port 443. And we've got a security group for this load balancer. And if I open that security group and look at the inbound rules, so you can see port 443, that's allowed from everywhere, so we can access the API server from anywhere, no restriction. Okay, so what else? So we've got the auto scaling group, one for the master instance group and one for the node, and we've got the launch configuration. So obviously, if you followed my Learn AWS playlist, auto scaling groups, you need to have launch configuration. So whenever you want to create a new worker node, it will use this launch configuration for this auto scaling group. And we've got one launch configuration for the master node as well. So these are all Debian machines. By default, you will get the Debian machines, but you can customize what OS you want for your master nodes or for your worker nodes. So if I do KOPS create cluster -- help and pipe that to less, if you search for image, yep, -- image, if you specify, you can specify what version or what operating system you want for your master or for your worker nodes. You can specify that. Alright, so that's launch configuration. We've got load balancers. Let's look at the VPC. Okay, so we've got two VPCs now. Initially we started with one VPC, which is the default VPC. Now if I go to the VPC, again it's all labeled and tagged. So that's the VPC, that's the network CIDR, and one VPC, one subnet, so that's the subnet. And whether it's a public or a private subnet, it should be a public subnet, which you can verify from the route table. 0.0.0, so that's the outbound traffic. It's going through the internet gateway, which means it's a public subnet. Alright, so we've got route table, so everything is labeled accordingly. And we've got the security groups for the load balancer, for the master, for the nodes and everything. So those are the things that I wanted to show you in the management console. So now if I go back to the EC2 dashboard, go to the instances, let's see how we can log into our EC2 instance. So for this, this is the master node, and if I grab the public IP address of the node, we should be able to log in to this master node. So I've got .ssh ID_RSA, so that's my private key. By default, if you don't specify, when you create the KOPS create cluster, you can specify what private key you want to use. So if you don't specify anything, it will try to use your default private key. So I've generated a default private key using SSH keygen. That will create ID_RSA, ID_RSA.pub, which is the public key. Actually, I shall write the command here, SSH keygen -t RSA -b 2048, for example. And if you want to specify the name for the key, my AWS key pair or something, and it will create the private and public key for you. Okay, so that's the key. And what's the user? I think the user is the admin user, I think. Let's try SSH. Yes, it's admin user at the IP address that we copied, the public IP address. I'm not specifying any private key because I'm using my default private key, but if you're using a different key, then you can use -i.ssh, your private key, which you used when you created your Kubernetes cluster using KOPS. Okay, yes, cool. So I'm now logged into my master node. If you do cat etc os release, so that's Debian version 9 stretch. So we've got our machine. So similarly, you can also log into one of your worker nodes. Let's try copy SSH admin at. Okay, cool. So we are now logged into our worker node cat etc os release. Again, it's Debian stretch. You can customize what operating system you want. At the moment, it's open to the public 0.0.0 by the security group, but only if you've got the right key you will be able to log into your master or worker nodes. But if you want to tighten the security, if you want to allow only certain network to be able to allow, you need to create a security group, and then you can pass that security group when creating KOPS create cluster command. KOPS create cluster -- help and search for security group, node security groups, master security groups. So you can specify the security group that you have created previously if you want to specify that, and you can use an existing VPC, an existing subnet, SSH access, your SSH public key, and all sorts of things that you can do. Okay, cool. I think that's all I wanted to show you in this video. kubectl version, and in the next video we will see how we can upgrade this Kubernetes cluster to version 1.16 something, a specific version. And in the same video we will also see how to upgrade to the latest available version. If you go to KOPS Kubernetes GitHub page, you will see a matrix. Let's see for which version of KOPS. We're using KOPS version 1.16.0, KOPS version 1.16.0, and what Kubernetes versions are supported for that particular version of KOPS you're using. Yep, there you go. So if you're using KOPS version 1.16.0, you can deploy a Kubernetes cluster from 1.12.x to 1.16.x. Alright, and if you're using one of the older version, you can only go up to 1.15.x. I think probably they've named it by the latest version that they can support 1.16.x, so it's 1.16.0, 1.15.x, 1.15.x, and so on. Alright, cool. Thank you so much for your time watching this video. Please give this a try and make sure to restrict the size of the instance that you deploy. Otherwise it will incur some cost. If it's just for less than an hour for learning purpose, doesn't matter, it's not going to cost you a fortune, but it's always good practice to specify what type of node, depending on the workload, depending on your Kubernetes cluster workload, what type of operations you will be performing. You can specify the size, type of your master nodes and worker nodes. Alright, thank you so much. I will see you all in my next video. Meanwhile, if you've got any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help. Bye bye.